Lovely. Okay, good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to this seasonal gardening task for wildlife workshop. A big thank you for coming along and, not sort of quitting on the workshop and spending the evening outside in the sun. I don't blame those that have at all. My name's Hayley Herridge and I'm Conservation Officer at Bug Life. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Bug Life, we're a conservation trust dedicated to saving invertebrate species from extinction and reversing declines, achieving sustainable populations. We are the only European champion for the conservation of all animals without backbones, from beetles and spiders to snails to worms, you name it, we cover it. I work on the urban buzz element of the Giving Nature a Home project in Cardiff, and I'm joined this evening by Jazz Austin from the RSPB, who is Policy Officer. Jazz is going to be managing the chat, so if you have any questions as we go, please put them in the chat and Jazz can field those. And then we will have some time at the end to answer a few questions, but we are going to sort of aim to finish promptly at 7:30. Oh no, sorry, 7. The session is recorded, so please turn your cameras off, and if you can sort of just mute yourselves to the mute yourselves as well, that would be brilliant. At about 6:15, you're going to receive an email, and that will contain a feedback form. We'd be really grateful. It only take a couple of minutes, so we'd be really grateful if you could fill that out. And there will also be links to our website where you can find a Welsh version of this presentation. And I've also put in there links to other kind of useful resources available online. So just a little bit about our projects. The Giving Nature a Home in Cardiff project is a partnership project delivered by RSPB Cymru, Cardiff Council Community Ranger Service and Bug Life Cymru. And it aims to engage local communities and families across Cardiff with nature and empower them to act for wildlife. And it has been funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. So this workshop tonight is essentially a checklist for wildlife-friendly kind of gardening tasks. We're going to throw in some habitat creation ideas and kind of top tips for wildlife gardening. So gardens more than ever have become a valuable refuge for wildlife, and it's never been more important to garden with wildlife in mind. Our landscape has changed significantly over the last 150 years with urban development and intensive farming, leading to less safe havens for wildlife, and what kind of wildlife-rich areas remain are often fragmented and in isolation. We now know that our wildlife is declining due to a number of factors caused by this sort of increasing pressure that we put on our natural landscapes. And if we don't act now, we're set to see declines ever increase and species become extinct. But gardens, on a positive note, gardens form a really important network of varied habitat that is vital as sanctuaries from intensively farmed countryside and flowerless kind of areas within urban landscapes. Some research from the University of Bristol revealed that within urban areas, gardens and allotments really are the hotspots in terms of pollinator species diversity and abundance. So it doesn't matter whether you have a large, small, or even just a balcony or a windowsill. There is something that we can all do that will contribute to a bigger picture as well, the kind of connectivity across the urban landscape. And I just want to highlight this because last week we launched our UK-wide network of beelines. And for those of you who may not be aware of beelines, this is one of Bug Life's big initiatives. They're essentially insect superhighways, and our kind of solution to the kind of decline in our wild pollinators. And it's all about restoring habitats across the country and connecting them up. And you can see on this map here that we have this connected network of green lines, and those are 3-kilometre wide corridors that have been mapped to with the aim of connecting up some of the best remaining wildflower rich habitats across the country by filling in the gaps of wildflowers. So everything that we do, no matter how small, contributes to this and will aid nature's recovery. And I've just sort of thrown a little fun Welsh fact in here that residential gardens in Wales cover the same amount of land as 25,633 rugby pitches. Okay, and that's the same number in hectares. So that's a vast area. So gardens can really contribute something. And, you know, it's small changes can make a huge difference in gardens, massively increasing their value for pollinators and therefore other wildlife. Planting wildlife friendly plants, leaving grass to grow and wildflowers to grow long, opening up connections to other gardens and allowing wildlife to move freely can make spaces more attractive. For gardens to be successful, they need to be able to provide 3 things, and that's food, water and shelter. And that includes kind of breeding sites and egg laying sites for our invertebrates. So we're gardening, the time of year is important, and that dictates what tasks need to be done. And to maximise the value of your garden for wildlife, you need to ensure that tasks are undertaken at the right time so they don't have a negative impact on wildlife. And I would say that it's good to get a kind of general understanding of life cycles of various species that may inhabit your garden as well. So you can be sure that you're not having any negative impact on their life cycle. So we're just going to sort of rewind the clock, go back a few months to winter to begin. And one thing that is, you know, kind of just really evidently crucial in winter is that we need to feed the birds. You know, freezing during winter dramatically, you know, puts birds at risks basically, and so feeding them can offer them a lifeline kind of at this difficult time of year. In this country, we really have a tradition of feeding birds, and that's progressed over the years from kind of leaving, you know, kitchen scraps and bacon and kind of breadcrumbs and things like that, to now these kind of really fancy feeding stations with, you know, various different foods. And those can attract, you know, various bird species. And so it really is like staggering. We spend millions on food and feeders every year now, and it's estimated around half of UK householders feed birds in their garden. The research suggests that it's best to, if you're going to start supplementing food for birds, that you do it throughout the year. And that's because it can support birds through the various stages of their life cycles. And though winter is a really important time to feed them, parent birds will supplement their diets during spring and summer when they're feeding their offspring. So, you know, in between them sort of hunting for aphids and caterpillars, you know, they can come along and feed on the various seeds and nuts and things that have been provided at a station. So just to sort of highlight some of the foods that are great for garden birds, this includes sort of seed mixes. I would say that there's varying quality of seed mixes out there. You can get the cheaper seed mixes that have been bulked out with things like wheat or split peas, beans, lentils, even rice. And perhaps these ones, you know, if you can afford the more expensive ones, then maybe kind of go with that, because you can end up sort of attracting lots of pigeons and maybe even kind of rats, which you may not want to attract into your garden. But seed mixes that have, you know, peanuts, maize, sunflower hearts, are great, loved by house sparrows and robins. Sunflower seeds, really rich in oils and antioxidants, and apparently the ones in the black shells have higher oil content than the striped ones. But even better, if you can just put sunflower seed hearts into a feeder, then you're saving the birds the job of kind of deshelling the seeds. And then we have nurture seeds, really good for goldfinches. Peanuts is an interesting one. You should definitely buy peanuts that have that are being marketed for birds, and that is because some of them contain a poisonous mold. So those marketed at for bird consumption have been tested and are guaranteed to be safe. There's also suet, which is a good thing to put out in winter only. I'd recommend you remove the nylon mesh, as this can kind of trap birds' legs. But don't use fat from cooking, as this can be bad for birds. It can smear their feathers and reduce their sort of ability to preen and keep warm at night. And there's also mealworms as well, which you can buy live or dried, and the dried ones can be rehydrated. Just a couple of things to note that you shouldn't feed birds. Those are dried fruits such as raisins and sultanas. These can also kill dogs. And mouldy and stale food and kind of sugary and salty foods. It's also in winter really important to provide water for birds to drink and bathe. Bathing wise, they regulate the oil distribution by bathing on their feathers, and this helps to sort of insulate themselves in winter and to fly more efficiently. In sort of freezing conditions, especially if we have sustained kind of periods of freezing where there is no water that available, you can make a makeshift bird bath by filling maybe a metal bowl with some water and putting a rock in the middle of it, and then balancing it over some bricks with a tea light or something underneath it, just to kind of stop the water from freezing over. Another thing really important to do is to clean bird feeders and bird baths regularly to maintain good hygiene. Just like us, birds are exposed to certain kind of bacteria, parasites and viruses, and feeding stations and bird baths that attract lots of birds can gather a kind of a build-up of bacteria and viruses on the surfaces, but also there can be transmission from bird to bird. So you can minimize the risk of this by cleaning the bird feeders and the bird baths regularly. You can clean with disinfectant. There are certain products for this very purpose, and then you can like rinse them out thoroughly with water and leave them to dry naturally. And you can also have multiple birds feeding stations within the garden, and so you can kind of move your feeders around the garden, and yeah, just by doing that you can help to kind of prevent transmission as well. Another thing you can do in winter when there's not much to do outside is make a bird box. This is, quite a real simple thing to do, and it's quite fun for families or schools. There are plenty of template designs on the net, including, specialist ones for certain species, such as like larger boxes with open fronts for owls. So you can go on the net and find your template and your list of instructions, etc. You want to use untreated wood, and I would say it's best to get these up in January, because you want to get them up before nesting begins. And data from a national study conducted by BTO, the British Trust of Ornithology, found that there are birds now that are breeding anywhere up to 31 days earlier than they were in the 1960s. For example, long-tailed tits can start really early in February, so it's best to get these up nice and early in the season. When you're erecting your bird box, you want to place it somewhere in a tree, facing between north and east, and this is to avoid strong sunlight, which you know, could cause overheating of nestlings. So you want to avoid strong sunlight and also the wettest winds as well. And you want to make sure, obviously, they're out the way of cats. And another good tip is to make sure that the birds have a clear flight path to the nest without any clutter sort of directly in front of the entrance. If positioned well, it shouldn't be too long before they are occupied. And once they're up, it's best to kind of leave them undisturbed. And then later in autumn, you can, you know, take your bird box down and remove the nesting material and any parasites that may be inhabiting the box, ready for the next year. So winter's also a good time to do your fruit tree pruning. I mean, this can be done in spring and summer as well, and it kind of depends on what your end goal is. The golden rule to pruning is to remove the 3Ds, the dead, the diseased, and the damaged. And winter prunings, particularly of you know, apples and pears and quinces, really encourages vigorous growth. So if you want new shoots and more flowers and therefore more fruits, prune in winter. It's also a good time to prune young fruit trees in their formative years, because once the leaves have fallen, you can get a good look at the overall shape of the tree. Because you kind of, with fruit trees, you want a classic kind of goblet shape, and so it just allows you to review the shape and prune as required. You can also prune trees in spring and summer, as I've kind of already said, so mainly stone fruits, or if your tree is too big and you don't want to encourage vigorous growth, you may sort of prune around this time. It's also good for trained apples and pears. You can also prune your shrubs and climbers, so late flowering clematis, bloodlear, climbing honeysuckle, and then they will flower best later in the year. And trim hedges, but I would say firstly, we need to let go of the idea that hedges need to be box shaped and kind of trimmed regularly. I do appreciate that some hedgerows need kind of management, particularly in smaller gardens, because you need to kind of you know, retain that functionality of the garden. You can't just have an unwieldy hedgerow taking over entirely. But if they're providing an important resource for pollinators, it's best to manage them on a rotational cycle, cutting them, you know, kind of every 3 years plus, and kind of rotating it so that you're maximizing the floral resource available to pollinators and food sources to other wildlife as well. If you are cutting on an annual basis, then you could be removing you know, flowering stems, you know, and therefore removing that kind of really crucially important resource actually for many pollinators in spring. So timing wise, if hedges need trimming, then you need to do this after the birds have eaten the berries in winter and before nesting season begins. So it really is a kind of midwinter job. Okay, so build a pond. This is one of the, a pond is one of the best features you could possibly have, I think, for wildlife in a garden. They support a vast majority of things, from amphibians to birds, mammals, insects that need a drink, you know, dragonflies, butterflies, grass snakes, aquatic species such as shrimp and snails and water beetles. They really are fantastic. So I've got just a list of kind of tips, I think, to kind of mention here. You want to locate your pond away from trees and shrubs. This is because they can cause heavy shading and debris will kind of fill up your pond. It's good to site them in a naturally kind of low part of the plot, where rainwater naturally kind of collects, and ideally kind of sheltered from the wind and in a sunny spot. When you build your pond, you can build it any time of year. If you build it in autumn, late winter, before things are kind of emerging from hibernation, then there's going to have less impact, and also things will establish much quicker come spring. They can be any size, so you can use a small container like the photo here on the right if you're limited on outdoor space. You can get pre-formed ponds from like garden centres, or you can like dig your own and either line it or leave it unlined, maybe use a clay lining. If you've got a large garden and plenty of space, then I would encourage a large pond. Large ponds are kind of easier to look after, and you get lower rates of water loss, so better with better chances of withstanding drought. A wildlife pond should have a good amount of shelving around the edges. These kind of shallow areas within the ponds where you'll kind of find most of the aquatic life. And when you're digging, if you hit subsoil, great, keep that subsoil, put it to one side, because you can use that as a growing medium within the pond. You don't want the topsoil because that's nutrient rich and that will cause issues within the water. But put the subsoil to one side, and then once you've insulated your pond, you can put a layer of subsoil. You can also put pebbles and cobbles and gravels within it to kind of form the base. You also want, ideally, to have some decaying wood along the water edge. If some of it could be half submerged, great. This will attract things like brown hawkers and southern hawker dragonflies, which like to lay eggs on the underside of the wood. It will also provide a refuge for amphibians. And another thing you can do with wood actually is to put a kind of thinner, long branch across the pond that will sit above the water, and this can create a lovely perch for dragonflies and damselflies, as well as birds to kind of rest on. You can also kind of create a beach to one side, creating nice gentle kind of access into the water as well. And there are, a whole host of native species that you can put in your pond. I would recommend native species only for ponds, because there are pond plant species that you can buy maybe from kind of larger garden centres, which are actually highly invasive if they kind of if they're let loose in the wild. For example, Crassula helmsley is an oxidating plant. It also just causes absolute havoc if it gets into lakes and ponds in the wild. In terms of amphibians, frogs really like shallow water. It's in their Latin, actually, rana temporaria. They kind of like temporary pools of water. Toads are more attracted to larger open bodies of water with lots of vegetation. Okay, so over winter, obviously you may be tempted to kind of dig your beds over. I'm personally a fan of Charles Dowding's no dig method, which I kind of would like to promote today. And the aim of that is to kind of support soil structure and organisms that live within the soil, that provide vital services such as aeration of soil and nutrient recycling. And the theory behind the no dig method is that you protect the soil, you protect the organisms by not breaking it up, and therefore the kind of soil can kind of function in a healthy manner, and it prevents, by not digging it over, you prevent damaging the organisms within the soil, and it enables the soil to kind of act more healthily and takes less time for things to kind of recover. what you do essentially is you put down cardboard with a top layer of mulch, and that acts as a kind of weed suppressant, so that prevents weeds from growing, and then you need to kind of replace the mulch over time. But it's a fantastic method of gardening, and what it really does, which is why I think it's really good for wildlife gardening, is that it it really supports biodiversity. So if you've got pupae in the soil, if you've got nesting solitary bees or other living things, you're not going to disturb them. It's also really good for soil retention too. So here we just highlighted the importance of using peat-free compost. I really can't recommend this enough. The use of peat really is a crime in my opinion, and the fact that it's still being harvested as a growing medium is quite shocking, really, because peat bogs support some of our rarest wildlife. They also act as invaluable carbon sinks, keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. They capture twice as much as standing forests, plus they filter water and prevent flooding. But at an alarming rate, they're being drained and stripped. So please, if you take one thing away from this, it would be probably to stop using peat-free compost. There are many alternatives out there, and I think the science is improving all the time. There are some really good mixes available now that contain things such as bark and woody material, green compost, coir, even bracken and sheep's wool and comfrey. So I think companies are looking at all the time how they can improve the kind of slow release of nutrients within peat-free compost. I have, as I've already said, there's a list of resources in the email that I've just sent to you. On that list is a link to the National Botanic Garden in Wales Pollinator Assurance Scheme, and they have a list of suppliers who are growing plants in peat-free compost and without the use of insecticides. So that's a good place to look if you're not sure where to go and buy plants from. So winter's a good time to buy your seeds, your bulbs and your tubers and things like that. I think it's it's really important now to kind of consciously shop. So it's good to sort of seek out suppliers where you know that you can rely on the supply chain of whatever it is you're buying. If you buy from small growers, then you can ring them up and you can ask them specific questions and they'll be happy to answer them, just so you can ensure that the plants are actually wildlife friendly, because surprisingly not all are. There are insecticides used in the growing process in many plants sold in garden centres. There are also, I think, as wildlife gardening is ever increasing in popularity, there are more and more places where you can buy wildflowers and kind of pollinator friendly plants, which is great. Winter also is a good time for planting trees and planting hedgerows, planting fruit trees. Trees and hedgerows are kind of like the backbones of gardens. They're the structure that holds the garden together. They provide habitat, shelter, shade and food. Hedgerows act as safe corridors for travel and landmarks for flying visitors such as bats, and make a sort of important component of any garden. They're also, good nesting sites for bumblebees and birds. So yeah, they're really, really important. Gardens in essence are very similar to woodland edge habitat, which is, a really biodiverse habitat. And that's because, gardens are kind of mimicking that structure from tall kind of trees to shrub layer down to kind of, the herbaceous plants and the ground growing plants. So gardens can be super biodiverse because there's that variety within them. In winter, yeah, you often plant particularly fruit trees kind of bare rooted. And so you need to get these in the ground quite quickly because you need to keep the roots wet. And I would say the best time to plant trees over winter is probably from late November to early March. And this is because the tree is dormant, and so you're likely to cause less damage to the tree. So we've got a list of flowers here that are good for pollinators that are flowering really early in the season. So I think our aim within a wildlife garden, if we can, is to provide something in flower throughout the whole year. And that is possible because of non-native plants and shrubs that may flower kind of over winter. But we're looking for sources where we're looking for plants that are providing pollen and nectar, but also food for caterpillars. Okay, and also it's probably worth mentioning that flowering plants are not only crucial to pollinators, which in turn kind of pollinate our food, but also because wildlife gardening is about supporting food chains and starting with those fundamental kind of building blocks, the soil, the plants, the invertebrates. And the more insect life you have in a garden and the more variety of insects, totally the result of the variety of plants you have, would provide more food and better habitat for things like bats and hedgehogs and snakes and amphibians and mammals. So we've got a list here of some early flowering species. We've got snowdrops, winter aconite, crocus, lesser celandine, and English bluebells. Definitely recommend English over Spanish bluebell because they hybridize and therefore not as useful to pollinators. And also we have an issue with kind of interbreeding of those two species within the wild. So wherever possible, native. And then we've got things like hellebores and primrose, mahonia, and trees that provide blossom kind of really early as well, such as winter flowering cherry. Another thing to probably note as well is that these flowers early in the season are really crucial now, especially with the kind of unpredictability of climate change. Because we're having warmer, milder winters, pollinators can wake up in winter, on warm days, fly around, and they're using up their kind of fat stores. But they may well need those fat stores a bit later on if we have a kind of cold snap. So if there's something in flower, they can sup on some nectar, and that will help, give them enough energy to kind of maybe help them go back into hibernation, or to get started if it's kind of just early or spring or late winter. So they can offer a bit of a lifeline. And this, interestingly, in London, the buff-tailed bumblebees, which are one of our earliest emerging bumblebees, have don't go necessarily into hibernation in London these days because there are so many non-native flowering shrubs through winter that they have the resource to carry on through. So there's been some really interesting research into that. Yes, I think I'm going to touch on native and non-native plants a bit later. If you're keen to kind of get growing, there's annuals that you can sow in winter for kind of a long growing season. If you're sowing annual wildflowers outdoors, I think the best time to do this is in autumn, on the other side of Christmas. Because ever increasingly, I think that the spring window for growing wildflowers from seed is becoming less reliable. We're having these, warm spring droughts quite early in the season, and that can lead to kind of the seed just sort of sitting on the surface of the earth and being eaten by pigeons. So the autumn window for growing wildflowers is really important. Okay, so moving on to spring now. So obviously food growing is great for us, and it's also really beneficial to wildlife too, in lots of obvious ways, such as the providing pollen and nectar sources. Um, and yeah, I would say that actually something to do this time of year. Obviously, you can start planting out, but also it's a good time to prune established plants. So like currants and gooseberries, um, yeah, it's a good time now to kind of cut those back so that they fruit really proficiently over this next year. There's also many other crops that you can grow that are great kind of pollinator friendly plants, including things like onion and carrots and runner beans, peas, courgettes, cucumbers. Tomatoes are an interesting one because they actually require bumblebees to pollinate them. They are part of the Solanaceae family, and that family have flowers that the anthers, so the male parts of the flowers, only release pollen if they have been vibrated. And bumblebees can do this. They sort of latch onto the flower, they dislocate their wings and vibrate their flight muscles, causing the pollen to be released. And for that reason, bumblebees have huge commercial significance worldwide for tomato growing. Another example of something you can do, which is great for pollinators, is you can just leave some vegetables in the ground, and the following year they'll flower. For example, parsnip, which is a biennial. If you leave a few parsnips in the ground, the following year you'll get these lovely tall plants with wonderful flowers, not too dissimilar to the flower here on the right. That's actually wild carrot. But the carrot family have these characteristic umbel shaped flowers. They're called the umbellifers, and each flower is nice and open and simple, and they're really attractive to hoverflies and beetles and solitary bees and wasps and things. So another great thing to do in spring is to erect a bee hotel. I'm such a huge fan of bee hotels. I think they're really entertaining. It was absolutely fascinating to sit and watch one. And they really help to boost local populations of aerial nesting solitary bees, such as red mason bees, blue mason bees, leaf cutters, yellow-faced bees, as well as wasps as well. So you'll get solitary wasps, cuckoo wasps, and even sort of parasitic species. You can buy pre-made hotels, or you can make your own. With pre-made, I would be careful that the holes aren't too large. You want holes between 2 mm up to 12 mm. And also solitary bees don't like splinters around the edges of the holes, so you just need to be wary of that as well, and that the bee hotels have a solid back on them. But I mean, these are something you can easily make. You can kind of create a box like you see here on the left, and then you can fill them with what natural materials you can get hold of, such as hollow plant stems, or you can drill holes into blocks of wood, bamboo, or actually you can buy purpose-made cardboard tubes. And I think anything that you can put in small components is good, because then you can remove those that have been used and replace them, just to prevent a kind of build-up of parasites. And yeah, holes should be between 2 and 10 millimeters, and that will just attract more of a variety of species. I put some links to really good guidance in the email. With cavity nesting bees, many of them are using a natural kind of material to help build their nests. So you can leave out mud in spring for mason bees, and they use that to create the partitions in their nest and the kind of seal the kind of the ends of the nests. Also great for swallows and house martins. You can plant lamb's ear, Stachys byzantina, for the woolcarder bee. That bee will carder the fine hairs from the leaves and use it to create the egg cells, in which it kind of puts a provision of pollen and it lays an egg within the nest. And that's a nice example of plant, get pollinator. If you put lamb's ear in and there's a local population of woolcarder bee, then you're likely to attract it into your garden. And it's a stunning bee, and it's one of our largest solitary bees. So yeah, that's just a really nice simple thing you can do. And also plant some roses in your garden, so such as dog rose, or there's a list of other kind of rose cultivars which are useful to leaf cutters, and they will cut the leaves to line their nests. There's also lots of, I suppose spring is a really great time for planting out. So you've got all your herbs such as marjoram, mint, borage, chives. Borage makes a really good companion plant, which is a good way of gardening if you're avoiding, if you're gardening, I suppose, in a wildlife friendly way and avoiding using pesticides, which definitely recommend you do. One of the most amazing things about borage is that it replenishes its stores of nectar every 2 minutes. You can also sow hardy annuals in spring, and so just to mention a few here, pot marigold, again, a great companion plant for growing vegetables. Phacelia is an absolutely fantastic green manure, and also just be absolutely covered in pollinators, so it's a lovely lovely one to include in the garden. And another one to mention probably is nasturtiums as well, which again can detract cabbage whites from your your brassicas when you're growing. It's also a good time to plant shrubs and perennials. So I've mentioned a few native shrub species here: privet, hazel, blackthorn and hawthorn. Really key species, providing really important pollen nectar sources in spring, but also larval food plants of moths, including privet hawk moth and willow beauty. I should say there's about 2,500 species of moth. So there's just an array of plants that are providing for pollinators, pollinating caterpillars, or not, so pollinating caterpillars of pollinators, I should say. So with wildlife gardening, I would say that native plants should take priority. Native plants and invertebrates have evolved together over millennia, and moths and butterflies use caterpillar food plants to lay their eggs. And the Butterfly Conservation have some really good lists that I have added to the email I've sent to you. I think we are only beginning to understand, in some respects, the intricacies between plants and invertebrates. But that's not to say that there aren't some fantastic non-native plants as well that are loved by UK pollinators. So I think the key to wildlife gardening is to plant native and non-native and plants from different countries, particularly from the Northern Hemisphere, although some exotics from the Southern Hemisphere will also be attracted to UK species. So in spring, you can introduce water plants around the pond. And I'm not going to kind of list any species here, but just to say that you can have plants from these 4 groups. So that includes floating aquatic plants, marginal aquatic plants that goes around the kind of the edge of the pond, something to oxygenate the water, and also grasses and reeds and rushes around the kind of edge of the pond. I think what you put in a pond is kind of determined by the size, but yeah, if you kind of go online and look at some lists of kind of native species, I just want to emphasize the nativeness here. Oh, okay, we've got 10 minutes. So in spring, it's time to kind of relax, I think, with the lawn mowing. We have this kind of tradition of being obsessed with mowing lawns, but really they can be fantastic spaces for wildflowers such as buttercups and cat's ears and daisies and clovers. So if you can relax the mowing in spring, cut less often and maybe cut at a higher setting, you can let the wildflowers already in the lawn kind of flourish. You can also plant plugs into the lawn with the intention of creating a kind of floral lawn. So things like bird's foot trefoil and red clover and self-heal do really well in lawns. They tolerate being mown and will continue to kind of flower. And if you remove the cuttings, then you'll lower the nutrient levels within the soil over time, and you'll start to find that more wildflowers will pop up. As well as kind of managing lawn as a floral lawn, you could also set aside part of it and kind of leave it to grow long like a meadow. And this very quickly will become, you know, its own ecosystem. It's one of the simplest things you can do, and yeah, one of the most important, I think, in terms of the benefits to and how many different species it can benefit. Yeah, and I suppose just to emphasize what I said earlier about increasing invertebrate species within a garden is going to benefit everything else as well. So yeah, there's a lot more going on than, you know, just kind of benefiting pollinators and the wildflowers. So in spring, you can create wildflower patches. This may be, you know, part of an established lawn or an area of bare ground which you wish to seed. You can buy local provenance seed online. You should just go online and check out who your local wildflower supplier is. There are various seed mixes, so you'll be able to find something that's suited to the particular patch you want to seed and the soil type. You can also plug plant as well. So if you have an established lawn, as well as maybe putting down a bit of seed, you might want to actually plant some small plugs, you know, of wildflowers. You can also, you know, just grow some wildflowers yourself over kind of winter, and, you know, until they're large enough and they've got a good enough root structure to be put in the ground. You can also carry out your kind of maintenance on established meadows at this time. So meadows do require maintenance. In spring, you know, if there's been a lot of grass growth over winter, you might want to cut that right back. It's also good to kind of mimic grazing by scarifying the ground, creating bare patches, which will allow the wildflowers to germinate. And also, if you're into scything, I would highly recommend getting a scythe. It's good to flatten out the molehills because they will blunt your scythe later in summer. So spring, you can trim back those winter and spring flowering shrubs. That will just promote kind of healthy growth. And you can build a compost bin. So composting is actually a really important part, I think, of wildlife gardening. It's got multiple purposes to, you know, a compost heap or, you know, compost bins. You can deal with those kitchen scraps, your garden waste. You can create nutrient-rich organic matter or growing medium for your food growing. And they can also home a variety of wildlife, from woodlice to amphibians, slow worms, etc. And if you have a small space, you could use one of those black plastic ones, or you can create your own. If you're using a method such as no dig, you might want to have several bays so that you can rotate those bays over time. If you're removing compost from a compost bin, I would say that the best time to do that is April only, because that's the ideal time between overwintering and before the breeding season, so you can kind of minimize disturbance to anything living. In spring, you can also put Reptile Refugia, so in the form of corrugated iron or old carpet. And this is just, you can put it down in a nice sunny spot in kind of long grass, and it just creates a nice, safe, warm place for cold-blooded reptiles to warm up. It's also a good way of being able to check to see what species you actually have living in your garden or allotment. And something else you can do, which you can do at any time of year, is to create hibernacular for reptiles. Essentially really kind of a log pile, I suppose, but you can dig a hole, a hollow area in the ground, fill the kind of bottom of it with a bit of gravel to create a bit of drainage, and then cover it over with logs and brash and leaves and the turf that you've removed, and that would just create a good place for, well, reptiles and amphibians to overwinter. So you can also create bee banks. So you may already have natural bee banks in your garden. Majority of solitary bees are ground nesting species, and they require short turf or bare ground or sparsely vegetative ground with kind of loose substrate in which they can easily burrow into to form their nests. And if you don't have these kind of naturally occurring somewhere, you may have bare ground around trees, you may have a bank, or you may have areas that are kind of well trodden and, like a footpath, for example. Those also can provide really good sites for nesting bees. But if you don't have that, then you can do something a bit novel, which is create a bee bank. And that you can see an example of one here on the right. And it's just a kind of core of aggregate capped with sand and formed into a kind of crescent shape designed like this. And that's to sort of trap warmth. So you want them to be south facing, and then the bees can kind of bask in the sun. And yeah, it's good to have a kind of a good source of food close by in the form of nectar and pollen. So in spring, obviously, the wildflowers really sort of begin to take hold here. So I think for spring, important thing to kind of note is not to cut back the wildflower at the hedgerow margins, leave corners of the garden to grow wild. Love your dandelions and don't sort of mow them down. Because lots of these plants are really, really important, either as caterpillar food plants or important sources of nectar and pollen at a time of year when there isn't huge amounts in flower. Okay, so moving on to summer, if you are short on space, or even if you're not, you can plant, in containers and hanging baskets with pollinator friendly annuals or perennials. The things like cosmos, pot marigold, thymes, bird's foot trefoil does really well in hanging baskets. And I actually also tend to plant kind of tumbling tomatoes in hanging baskets in my garden, because I've got a very small urban garden, and they provide nice floral resource for bumblebees, and then also we get lots of tomatoes later in the year. So in summer, you kind of need a regular source of water to keep everything going. There are some really nifty ways of reserving water, which I'm not going to touch on. I would kind of watch them Gardener's World episodes, because there's always some really cool things on there. But I suppose you really need to think about this earlier in the year, because you need to get your butts into position and, you know, containers set out that can collect rainwater, so that in summer, when you need to kind of, you know, water plants to keep them all going, you're using as much as possible rainwater that you've collected on site, just to keep your energy bills down, but also, more importantly, to conserve water. You can also, you know, use this to top up ponds if ponds start to run dry. And yeah, obviously you'll need to keep water your plants in good health by watering them and kind of feeding them through the summer. Another thing you can do, which again is maybe a bit more novel, really great and really interesting thing to do, is create a hoverfly lagoon. So I mean, hoverflies really are a delight of the garden, and really important pollinators of wildflowers, fruits and vegetables. They have really interesting ecology, and it's really kind of varied. But some of them have an aquatic larval stage and can be found in rainwater-filled holes in trees, known as rot holes. And you can mimic those in your garden by creating containers that are filled with kind of grass clippings. And yeah, you can fill a container with grass clippings and then top it with water, put some sticks in, and then on top put a layer of dried leaves. And the dried leaves provide a place for the female hoverflies to land on, to lay their eggs. And the larvae of aquatic hoverflies are called rat-tailed maggots, and they will feed on rotting organic matter underwater, and they have these long breathing tubes, the tails. And so you can mimic these in gardens, and they're quite cool kind of experiment to do, if you don't mind kind of stagnant, smelly water in places. So hedgehogs, really important to think about hedgehogs, because they've been suffering massively in the UK. And, you know, you can build a hedgehog home, providing a real safe place for them to nest and hibernate and raise their hoglets. And they're nocturnal animals, aren't they? And they're carnivorous. But, you know, a lot of their wild habitat is gone. So we kind of need to replicate that where we can. So I think it's good to provide undisturbed areas for hedgehogs, piles of leaves, logs for them to hibernate under. And again, by planting lots of things that are going to attract invertebrates, in turn, we're going to be providing lots of feed for hedgehogs. Also, another thing you can do for hedgehogs is cut holes in the fence and, you know, put away those slug pellets. There's a really cool campaign actually run by the Hedgehog Preservation Society and the People's Trust for Endangered Species called Hedgehog Street, which is all about people getting together to provide thoroughfares through gardens for hedgehogs. So summer flowers here, and sorry, I am running over a bit, but we don't have a huge number of slides left. I wanted to highlight on this slide just the variety of pollinators associated with some of these plants. With wild rock rose, there's the brown argus, there's the green hair streak, marjoram, there's the mint moth, kidney vetch, the small blue, mullein, we've got the mullein moth, honeysuckle, there's the early grey that feeds on that, varied cornet feeds on sweet William, sorry. Bird's-foot trefoil attracts the common blue and the six-spot burnet moth, and the scarlet tiger moth feeds on comfrey. So such an array, you know, array of different pollinators can be attracted just through planting the right plants. Also to note here, everlasting peas, you know, is liked very much by leaf cutters. And there's several moths that feed on dog rose, lime, and privet. Okay, so in autumn, things are starting to slow down. It's a time of abundance. For much wildlife, it's a time of fattening up before going into hibernation. So, let things die back naturally, leave seed heads in situ. Plants such as teasels, thistles, and sunflowers will provide, seeds for birds. And also, our windfalls should be left in situ as well, because birds and autumn fruit have kind of evolved together. And, apples and berries and hips and haws provide a fantastic feast for birds over winter, as well as, other species as well. You'll find things like a red admiral feeding on rotting fruit late in the season. Yeah, can also keep weeding to a minimum and just allow leaves to kind of fall and remain where they are, and this will provide protection for invertebrates such as earthworms and millipedes and woodlice and snails and beetles. But I would also say, with the abundance of leaves on the ground, it's a good time to collect some to make leaf mold, which will create a really nice compost for your kind of food growing and for your flower beds. And also you can kind of cover your hibernacula for reptiles and cover those hedgehog houses with leaves kind of at this time of year. Autumn also presents a good time to kind of get things going as well in the ground. So you can plant herbaceous perennials, particularly those that may flower in the following spring. And it's really good time of year for planting bulbs. So native daffodils, native bluebells, crocus, snake's head fritillary, I'll get them in kind of September, early October time. You can also plant things that may flower slightly later, like alliums. But I would note that some bulbs do better planted when they're growing. So, for example, snowdrops and winter aconite and wild garlic, I would plant them in the green. So I would plant them in spring and buy them already kind of grown. A way of saving pennies, you can take hardwood cuttings from things like, shrubs, dogwood, roses, rosemary, your other herbaceous perennials. Really good way of keeping costs down. You can also, take a bit from, your friends or relatives' gardens as well and kind of get stuff going for the next year. You can also build a bug hotel. So I won't go into much detail here, but you've probably seen them before. Stacks of pallets filled with kind of found materials. Some of those can be natural or man-made, but you're creating lots of cracks and crevices. You can fill the center with straw, making a nice warm, dry kind of nest space. And if you drill some holes into wood and put in some hollow canes and things like that, then you'll be providing for solitary bees as well. But I tend to think more of these as places for things to take refuge and to hibernate, unless they do have, a good amount of hollow stems and kind of holes in blocks of wood. Then they're also providing for solitary bees. Deadwood is a really important resource and one I just kind of want to highlight here. When I say deadwood, I mean dead and decaying wood, and not necessarily stuff that is loose and kind of fallen on the ground. As trees age, they get injured, limbs break off, maybe bracket fungus starts feeding on the kind of, gets into the wound and starts feeding on the heartwork. And as this happens, the tree becomes ever increasingly better for biodiversity, because you get these really distinct little microhabitats, such as cavities, rot holes, sap runs, and they will attract an array of some of our rarest species, known as saprosylic invertebrates. And saprosylic species are basically those that are dependent on dead and decaying wood for part of their life cycle. And in turn, actually, species that prey on those species are also known as saprocyclic. So if you do find that a tree has a bracket fungus, don't think immediately, I need to cut this down, because actually it's just beginning to get really exciting for biodiversity. And if it doesn't cause a kind of safety issue, then I would say leave it and kind of let it do its thing, and, you know, watch what comes in. So as I said earlier, autumn really is the best time to create a kind of wildflower patch. You want to cut the grass really, really short, create 50 to 80% bare ground, cast your wildflower seed, and, you know, tread that seed in. You can also plant plugs at this time of year, and it really is the kind of best time because the ground is generally much more moister, and your seeds can get off to a really good start without having to compete with grasses and things like that. If your soil's really nutrient rich, then you want to maybe think about turf stripping before you cast your seed. So autumn flowers for pollinators, I just want to highlight here really one, because I know we don't have much time, and that is ivy. I think it's, you know, it's one of the most important wildflowers in autumn, and it just has sort of, you must let ivy mature because it only flowers in its kind of mature state. But you'll notice on it an array of pollinators all kind of feeding up before they go into hibernation. And it's also creates good shelter for hibernating things such as some of the veneted butterflies. So finally, just going to finish on some rules for planting for pollinators. Okay, just some top tips here. So avoid plants with double or multiple flowers. That's because they either produce no pollen and nectar, or the petals create issues in terms of allowing pollinators to kind of access the nectaries. Also, you want to aim to grow kind of native plants and plants of local provenance. So really find out if you've got some small local supplier, organic or not. You know, if you can ask the grower directly the questions such as, you know, how have you grown these? Have you used pesticides, etc., then, you know, that's way better than going to a garden centre where you really don't know where your plants are kind of coming from. Native plants will also do better in terms of they're more suited to our climate and our soils. Avoid bedding plants, often bred to be really showy, but in that process have lost their value for wildlife. And particularly for bumblebees, it's good to plant flowers in large drifts, or I'd say have several patches of the same kind of species within a bed. And that's just because bumblebees in particular do something called flower constancy, where they learn to forage from a flower, and if there's an abundance of it, they'll just keep going with that particular species, maybe ignoring everything else around. If they have to waste time learning to forage from other things, and it just kind of uses up energy and time they don't have. And you know, choose organic you know, seeds and plants wherever possible. But yeah, there are those small nurseries that maybe can't afford to be certified organic. Sometimes they're going beyond, you know, above and beyond what others are doing who are certified organic. So it's really good to kind of get to know your local grower, really, form a relationship with them, and then you can just be rest assured that the plants you're putting in your garden really are safe for wildlife. Okay, and finally, there are so many resources online, and I've put loads of links in the email I've just sent to you. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I've gone over by 12 minutes, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Hayley. I feel like I've learned lots. There's been quite a few questions going through the chat, but we've kind of been addressing them as we go along. There was a couple though that I didn't know the answer to, and if anyone else has other questions, feel free to pop them in, and we can go through what we can in 5 minutes or so. So one of them I didn't know, Hayley, is if plants will find a pond, or if we kind of if the recommendation is to kind of plant them up already. So my kind of assumption was that it probably depends on what's already there, kind of habitats nearby.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. I think if you're in the middle of an urban area and basically kind of isolated by kind of urbanness, then you're probably going to need to bring the plants in. But if you're located next to a nature reserve that has ponds, then it might be surprising what kind of makes its way by itself. Plants do turn up, but you probably want to plug plant just to make sure that you've got some nice vegetation in your pond.
That's great, thanks, Hayley. Another one that just come in are mosquitoes a real problem in ponds?
So I think mosquitoes do well in water that's quite low in oxygen, and they're often a kind of sign of water quality, aren't they? If you've got poor water quality, then you may have quite a few mosquitoes. So I think if you've got a pond that's healthy and is a really healthy functioning ecosystem, then I don't think there would be too much of an issue.
That's great, thanks, Hayley. I think the only other one was we had a question around creating a pond, and I've kind of pointed the direction of the Urban Birds Advice Pack, but it was the question was specifically around a large clay pond. And is there anything you think you'd need to do differently, or if there's anything we need to do differently with a kind of clay pond to the different type of pond that we've already kind of produced the guidance for?
I mean, clay ponds are kind of great because they're just made with natural materials, and you're not using any kind of man-made liner. But the issues with clay ponds is that if tree roots grow through the clay, then you can just have this pond that's forever kind of draining. And my experience with clay lined ponds is that they end up just a kind of puddle because they've been drained by something piercing the clay kind of lining. So there's kind of many professionals that actually kind of recommend a lining, just because you're guaranteed to be able to hold the water in the pond.
Cool, thanks, Hayley. We've got two more pond questions, and I think we'll need to wrap up. Okay. One of them is, we have a small pond under 1 metre squared. Our neighbour has 5 common newts that she would like us to rehome. Will this be big enough for 5 newts? We have a log pile, pond plants nearby.
And the neighbour's quite close by?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, particularly I suppose with frogs, we kind of recommend not transplanting frogs from one pond to another, just because to prevent any kind of transmission of disease and things like that. But if it's a kind of rescue mission, then I think newts probably require a bigger pool in which to breed, and they like kind of deeper water, so it may not be suitable for breeding.
Thanks, Hayley. And the last question is, a small pond has lots of frogs in it, and today they are sitting on the frog spawn, and there are about 15 sitting on it. Is this usual behaviour?
Yeah, I would say so. That sounds brilliant. You should take some photos of that.
Yeah, it sounds great. Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much, Hayley. That was really interesting. We've had a really active chat tonight, so thank you everyone for engaging and asking.
Great. I think someone's just put some more information in there about clay liners. Yeah, no, thank you, everyone. Yeah, there is a feedback form in the email I've sent you. So just a couple of questions. If you could spare a couple more minutes and fill that out, that would be absolutely brilliant. Yeah, and my email's also in that email, as well. So you can contact me to ask me any other questions. Okay, thanks very much.
Cool, thanks everyone. And yeah, I hope everyone has a nice rest of your evening. Thanks. Bye.